In 1942, the Pacific War was falling apart. Bombers were missing, convoys were unstoppable, and one man, a mechanic, not an engineer, not a general, was about to change the entire course of World War II with a wrench, a torch, and an idea no one believed could work. This is the story of the man the Japanese called Black Death. Before the world knew the name Papy Gunn, before the B-25 became the most feared gunship of the Pacific, the Allies were losing the war. Convoys slipped through New Guinea untouched, bombers fell from the sky, and a mechanic, just one mechanic, was about to change everything. In August 1942, the Pacific theater was balanced on a knife edge. Japanese forces were reinforcing New Guinea at will, landing troops, artillery, and supplies faster than the Allies could respond. The 5th Air Force, operating from remote, muddy airstrips across northern Australia and Papua, was exhausted, under-equipped, and largely ineffective against Japanese shipping. The strategic problem was brutally simple. High-altitude bombing didn't work. Not against moving ships. Not in Pacific weather. Not with the equipment the Allies had. At 15,000 feet, bombs drifted hundreds of meters. Pilots couldn't see the ships through cloud breaks. Bombardiers couldn't lead targets accurately. In July 1942 alone, the 3rd Attack Group lost 11 A-20 Havocs attempting high-altitude runs on Japanese convoys, and when they tried to attack lower, the results were worse. Japanese deck gunners, well-trained, aggressive, and supported by Zero escorts, ripped through the unarmored bellies of American medium bombers. Crews were dying, convoys were surviving, the Allies were losing New Guinea. Something had to change, and that change began with a man who wasn't even supposed to be there. Captain Paul Irvin Papy Gunn, 43 years old, looked nothing like a revolutionary. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a designer. He wasn't even Army Air Forces. He'd only recently transferred from the U.S. Navy. What he was, and what mattered, was this: the most gifted aircraft mechanic the Pacific had ever seen, with 21 years of experience keeping planes alive in the harshest conditions on Earth. Before the war, he had run Philippine Airlines. When the Japanese invaded Manila in January 1942, Gunn evacuated by flying a civilian aircraft under fire. His wife, Polly, and their 4 children were captured and imprisoned at the Santo Tomas internment camp. From that moment forward, Gunn fought with one purpose: every mission, every modification, every risk was one step closer to getting back to his family. He volunteered for every job, flew every aircraft, and spent every night turning wrecks into weapons. In mid-1942, Gunn was assigned to Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, where a grim reality confronted him. The A-20 Havoc, the 3rd Attack Group's workhorse bomber, carried only 4 nose-mounted, plus their .30 caliber machine guns. Against Japanese transports and destroyers, .30 caliber rounds were practically useless. They bounced off steel hulls. They splintered against armored gun positions. They couldn't suppress deck crews long enough for bombers to reach release point. Pilots were dying because the aircraft simply weren't built to fight the enemy in front of them. Gunn saw the flaw immediately, and he reached a conclusion that seemed insane. If the bombers couldn't survive the approach, the solution wasn't to drop bombs from higher. The solution was to go lower. Lower than anyone thought possible. Lower than training manuals allowed, lower than Japanese gunners could process. A low-altitude attack, a skip bomb at mast height, a devastating forward gun barrage to silence every gun on deck. To do that, he would turn the A-20 into a flying shotgun. At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1942, Gunn stood under the wing of an A-20 at Eagle Farm. Beside him, ground crews were torch-cutting steel frames, welding mounts, and fitting 4 salvaged 50-caliber Browning machine guns into the bomber's nose. Not 30 cals, not defensive guns, but 4 heavy Brownings, firing a combined 1,700 rounds per minute. They scavenged guns from wrecked P-39s and P-40s, engines that wouldn't fly again, pilots who were dead, guns that were still perfectly lethal. The idea was simple: overwhelm the deck guns, get within skip-bombing range, strike at point-blank distance. But the engineering wasn't simple at all. 4 50-cal guns weighed 64 lbs each plus ammunition, more than 200 lbs added to the nose. The A-20's center of gravity shifted dangerously forward. The first test flight nearly killed the pilot. The nose dropped. The aircraft refused to climb. It wanted to pitch straight into the ground. Gunn spent 2 days rebalancing the aircraft, moving equipment aft, adjusting trim, redistributing weight. He flew it himself. The second test pilot described it best. It flies like it's angry, but it flies. The first strafer was officially alive. The proof of concept. September 12th, 1942. Gunn didn't wait for approval. He didn't ask for permission. General George Kenney, new commander of the 5th Air Force, told him, "You have 1 week. Prove it works." On September 12th, 16 modified A-20s launched low over the trees toward Boona Airfield. They came in at treetop height, guns blazing, bullets walking across the ground like a firestorm. When the smoke cleared, 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed, multiple AA positions silenced, not a single A-20 lost. Kenney didn't need a report. He had seen the results. He wanted more. But the A-20 had limits: short range, limited bomb load, not enough internal space for more weapons. If Gunn wanted to build a true flying destroyer, he needed a bigger platform, and there was only one candidate: the B-25 Mitchell, a bigger canvas. In December 1942, Gunn pulled the bombardier and glass nose off a B-25C and began rebuilding it from the inside out. 4 50-cal guns in the nose, 4 more in cheek packs. The top turret rotated forward, ammunition racks expanded, armor plates added, wiring rerouted, fuselage reinforced, 10 forward-firing guns, an aircraft that fired 215 lbs of lead per second. Ground crews called it Papy's folly. Pilots said it would never fly. Engineers said it would tear itself apart. Commanders said it was too radical. Gunn didn't care. He flew it himself. The takeoff was terrifying. Nose heavy, fighting the stick, threatening to drop. But once airborne, it was a monster. A gun platform unlike anything the Allies had. Kenney ordered 12 more immediately. By February 1943, 30 B-25 strafers were ready for combat, and just in time, because Japanese naval intelligence had decrypted Allied troop buildup. A massive convoy was leaving Rabaul, 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 7,000 troops, all headed to reinforce Leh. The Allies had 72 hours to stop it. Everything Gunn had built, every weapon he had designed, every risk he had taken, was about to be tested in the battle that would define his legacy. Previously, Papy Gunn had transformed the A-20 Havoc and the B-25 Mitchell into low-altitude gunships. 30 modified B-25 strafers now stood ready in Papua, armed with 10 forward-firing .50 caliber guns each. And just as they became operational, Allied codebreakers intercepted a message. A massive Japanese convoy was underway. 7,000 soldiers, 8 transports, 8 destroyers. The fate of New Guinea would be decided in the next 72 hours. The Japanese convoy moves south. February 28, 1943. Late on February 28, 1943, Allied codebreakers in Melbourne intercepted Japanese naval signals. A convoy had departed Rabaul. 8 large transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops of the Japanese 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers. The objective was clear: reinforce the garrison at Lae on New Guinea's northern coast. If the troops reached Lae, the Japanese could fortify the town, reinforce their positions, and threaten Allied operations across the entire island. New Guinea might be lost. General Kenny understood the stakes instantly. Sink the convoy. If we fail, the New Guinea campaign collapses. There were only 72 hours to stop the Japanese fleet before it reached Lae. Aerial reconnaissance tracked the convoy entering the Bismarck Sea, a wide, storm-lashed corridor of water between New Britain and New Guinea. Japanese commanders believed the monsoon weather would protect them. Thick clouds, heavy rain, low visibility. They knew high-altitude bombers couldn't hit moving ships in such conditions. They were right, but they didn't know that high altitude was no longer Kenny's plan. March 2nd, 1943, the first attempt fails. At dawn on March 2nd, B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 15,000 feet, threading their bombs through gaps in the cloud deck. 137 bombs fell, none hit. The Japanese ships maneuvered easily, slipping through the splashes. The convoy continued south, hugging the coastline. That afternoon, a message came from reconnaissance aircraft. Convoy intact, speed unchanged, estimated arrival, Lae, March 4th. The clock was ticking. The strike force assembles. Night of March the 2nd, at Port Moresby, Major Ed Larner of the 90th Bombardment Squadron gathered his men. 12 B-25 strafers, 30 modified A-20 Havocs, Beaufighters of the Royal Australian Air Force, P-38 Lightnings for escort. Gunn's B-25s would attack at masthead height, 50 feet above the water. It had only been practiced once. Larner explained the plan. High-altitude bombers would attack first, forcing Japanese gunners to look up. Papy's strafers would come in low at wave-top height, guns firing continuously. Skip bombs would be dropped at point-blank range, skipping off the water into the ship's hulls. A navigator asked, "What happens if we take fire during the approach?" Larner didn't hesitate. "We'll find out tomorrow." No one slept. March 3rd, 1943, the day everything changed, around 6:30 a.m. The Allied Armada, over Cape Ward Hunt, 137 Allied aircraft assembled. B-17s took the lead. Below them, the strafer groups formed into attack lines. 12 B-25s abreast, each carrying 14 forward-firing 50 cal guns. To the north, the Japanese convoy steamed onward, unaware that history was about to be rewritten. The high-level attack. The distraction. At 10,000 feet, B-17s began their bombing runs. Anti-aircraft guns erupted, the air filled with black smoke and metal shards. The Japanese gunners were focused upward, and that's when the sea-level thunder rolled in. The strafers arrive. Wave-top terror. Major Larner led the B-25s in from the southeast. They came in so low that their propellers kicked spray from the water. At 2 miles out, the Japanese crew aboard the transport Kyokusei Maru saw the wall of aircraft. The ship's captain ordered a hard turn to starboard. Too late. At 800 yards, the B-25s opened fire. 14 50 cals per aircraft, 168 guns across the formation. The water between the planes and the ship churned into white foam, bullets walking forward like a chainsaw. Bridge windows shattered. AA gunners fell where they stood. Radio operators never reached their headsets. 3 B-25s released their bombs at 100 yards. The first bomb skipped, hit the hull, detonated inside the engine room. The second, tore through midships. The third missed. Kyokusei Maru was burning and sinking within 30 seconds. It went under in 40 minutes. The slaughter continues. Ship after ship. Taiyo Maru, running doesn't work. The transport Taiyo Maru tried to flee at full throttle. The B-25s were doing 240 knots. 4 strafers bracketed the ship. The 50 cal streams stitched across the deck. Gunners died before aiming their weapons. 8 bombs dropped. 5 hit. The ship broke in half. Most troops below deck never escaped. It sank in 6 minutes. Shirayuki and Shikinami, destroyers under fire. Australian bow fighters struck next, hammering destroyers Shirayuki and Shikinami. Japanese AA fire hit 1 bow fighter, but the pilot held course, strafing the deck from bow to stern before crashing into the sea. By the time Gunn's B-25s arrived, the destroyers were crippled. Multiple bomb hits, fires spreading, crew abandoning ship. The convoy collapses, 09 WOM. By mid-morning, 5 transports were burning or sinking. 2 destroyers crippled, survivors in the water, vessels scattering in panic. The once proud convoy was now a shattered graveyard, spread across 40 square miles. But the day wasn't finished, not even close. The second strike, 14 p.m. The Zeros, stationed at Leh, had landed to refuel. They were on the ground when the second Allied wave arrived. The transport Oigawa Maru was hit by 12 bombs. Its magazine detonated in a single massive flash, visible from 130 miles away. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained. No survivors, no wreckage, just an empty patch of sea. Nearby, the destroyer Asashio attempted to rescue survivors. 3 A-20 Havocs hit it simultaneously. Its forward deck erupted. The ship burned through the night and sank at dawn on March 4th. The aftermath, annihilation. By the end of March 3rd, all 8 Japanese transports were sunk. 4 destroyers lost. Only 200 of 7,000 troops reached Leh. Thousands drowned or were killed in the air attacks. Allied losses, 4 aircraft, 13 crewmen. General Douglas MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. The Japanese never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by large convoy. And the reason was simple. Papy Gunn's impossible gunship had worked far beyond anything the engineers believed possible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't just stop a convoy. It changed the entire Pacific War. But back in the United States, something strange was happening. The Wright Field engineers, the ones who said Gunn's aircraft could not fly, had just issued a formal recommendation. Ground every modified B-25 immediately, and General Kenny was about to give them the shock of their career. Previously, the impossible airplanes had destroyed the Japanese convoy in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, thousands of troops lost, all because of low-flying gunships that official engineers claimed should never have been airborne. And while the 5th Air Force celebrated its most decisive victory to date, a message from the United States arrived that stunned everyone. The modified B-25s were to be grounded immediately. The engineers who didn't know they were wrong, while smoke still rose from the Bismarck Sea. Engineers at Wright Field, Ohio, thousands of miles from the front, were studying the early reports of the newly modified B-25s. They didn't have combat footage. They didn't have first-hand observations. They only had theoretical calculations. And on paper, Gunn's gunship was a disaster. The nose too heavy, the balance dangerously forward, the recoil forces excessive, the fuselage skin too thin for cheek-mounted guns, the airframe never designed to fire 1450 caliber guns simultaneously. After 3 days of analysis, the engineers issued their verdict. The modifications were unsafe, impractical, and should be discontinued immediately. The official recommendation was blunt: ground all modified B-25s. The engineers had no idea that, at that exact moment, the same unsafe, impractical airplanes had just wiped out an entire Japanese convoy. Kenny's explosive meeting in Washington. General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, happened to be in Washington when Wright Field's recommendation arrived. He read the report in silence, then walked directly into the Pentagon office of General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of all Army Air Forces. The Wright Field engineering delegation was already inside, prepared to explain why Gunn's concept violated aircraft design principles. Before they could speak, Kenny told them the truth. "Gentlemen, 12 of those airplanes you say can't fly just sank a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every transport, every destroyer. We are modifying 60 more right now." The engineers stared at him, stunned. Their equations had betrayed them. The battlefield had not. Arnold, who trusted Kenny completely, leaned back in his chair and saw the situation for what it was. The Pacific needed more strafers immediately, and whatever Wright Field believed, Gunn's airplanes worked. The war had already proven it. Within minutes, he dismissed the engineers, nearly throwing them out of his office, and issued a message to North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25. "Prepare to evaluate and incorporate Papy Gunn's modifications into full factory production." The only man who could explain the impossible, Kenny cabled Australia. "Send Gunn to California immediately." Gunn didn't want to go. His family was still imprisoned in Manila. Every mission he flew brought him closer to the Philippines. Leaving now meant abandoning the front at the moment he felt closest to reaching them. But orders were orders, and Kenny told him bluntly, "You're the only man who knows these modifications well enough to teach the factory. Go for 6 weeks, then come back and finish the war." On March 27, 1943, Paul Papy Gunn arrived at North American Aviation in Long Beach, California. The plant was enormous. 20,000 workers, 3 shifts around the clock, an aircraft rolling off the line every 4 hours. Gunn, still limping from months of stress and exhaustion, carried with him a folder of hand-drawn sketches, grease-stained, pencil-marked diagrams of gun mounts, blast tubes, reinforcement ribs, and improvised ammunition racks. To the factory engineers, these sketches were shocking. Gunn's answers were even more shocking. They asked for wind tunnel data. He said he had flown the tests. They asked for stress calculations. He showed them which parts had dented during recoil and how he reinforced them in the field. They asked why the cheek gun mounts weren't tearing through the fuselage. He pulled a welded blast tube from his bag and said, "They did, so I fixed it." It became clear that Gunn was not a theoretician. He was a wartime mechanic who solved problems by trial, error, and sheer nerve. And his solutions worked in the one environment that mattered: combat. The birth of the factory-built gunship. For 2 full weeks, North American engineers studied every weld, every brace, every modification Gunn had made under battlefield conditions. They redesigned structural mounts for mass production, reinforced fuselage skins with heavier aluminum, recalculated center of gravity adjustments, reorganized ammunition storage, and standardized wiring layouts. What began as a crude field modification was refined into a blueprint for full industrial-scale manufacturing. On May 10, 1943, the first factory-built B-25G strafer rolled off the assembly line. It carried 4 50-cal guns in the nose, 2 in external cheek packs, 2 in the turret that could be rotated forward, and, most extreme of all, a 75mm M4 cannon mounted in the fuselage. This cannon was the same gun used in the M3 Lee tank. When Gunn test-fired it, the aircraft shuddered violently. The shell casing recoiled 4 feet. Rate of fire was 1 round every 30 seconds. Too slow for fast targets, but devastating against ships. North American built 400 of the B-25G, then pushed further. The B-25H added 4 more 50-caliber guns and improved the 70mm cannon system. Finally came the B-25J, the deadliest variant of all. 18 forward-firing guns, no cannon, and unmatched low-level firepower. Nearly 5,000 gunship-configured B-25s were produced, all carrying the DNA of Gunn's original A-20 and B-25 conversions. Gunn returns to war exactly 6 weeks after he left. Gunn returned to Australia, just as Kenny promised. He wasted no time. His legs still hurt, his uniform still stained from months of flying, but he immediately returned to work modifying aircraft, pushing new ideas, and accompanying strike missions whenever possible. Because for Gunn, this war was not abstract. It was not strategic theory or aerial doctrine. It was personal. Every aircraft he armed, every mission he flew, every enemy ship that burned was 1 step closer to Manila, 1 step closer to freeing his wife and children from the Santo Tomas internment camp, and the war was about to accelerate toward that path. Previously, Gunn returned from California with a transformed B-25, a factory-built gunship, refined and standardized from his battlefield inventions. The 5th Air Force finally had an aircraft built for the Pacific, a flying destroyer, and just in time, because Japan's grasp on New Guinea was collapsing and air power was about to finish the job. When Gunn stepped back onto the rough Australian tarmac in May 1943, he brought with him something far more valuable than rank or orders. He brought legitimacy. His modifications were no longer field improvisations. They were now factory designs approved by North American Aviation, endorsed by General Arnold, and desperately awaited by the men fighting across New Guinea. But even before the first American-built strafers arrived in the combat zone, Gunn's original conversions were rewriting the war. Within weeks of his return, B-25 strafers were hitting Japanese shipping, coastal supply points, and troop concentrations with a speed and violence Japanese commanders had never imagined. Convoys once sailed boldly through the Solomon Sea. Now they crept at night, hugging shorelines, blacked out, zigzagging desperately. It didn't matter. The strafers found them anyway. Throughout mid-1943, the 5th Air Force unleashed a relentless sequence of low-level strikes. In April, strafers and A-20s destroyed 16 Japanese barges near Finschhafen, tearing them apart in minutes. In May, 12 Japanese cargo vessels were smashed at Wewak Harbor. In June, B-25s struck the oil installations at Balikpapan, Borneo, igniting fireballs so massive that pilots 80 miles away saw the glow. These weren't isolated victories. They were strategic ruptures. Japan's logistics system in New Guinea began to crumble. Barges sank faster than replacements could be launched. Fuel deliveries dried up. Outposts starved in silence. As one Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans come from the sea and from the clouds. They strike when we cannot see them. They kill without hesitation. These planes are death itself." The Japanese soon gave the B-25 strafer its infamous nickname, Black Death. But the deadliest demonstration of the strafer's power came on November 2nd in 1943, the raid on Rabaul. Rabaul, the fortress of fortress cities, Bristled with anti-aircraft guns, fighters, and naval vessels, no sane commander would order low-level attacks into such a hornet's nest. But General Kenny believed his pilots knew something the Japanese didn't. Firepower at 50 feet beats, flak at 5,000. On that morning, 137 Allied aircraft converged on the harbor. P-38 Lightnings swept ahead, ripping through zero formations. B-24 Liberators bombed from 20,000 feet, forcing Japanese gunners to look skyward. That was when the B-25 strafers arrived, sliding under the smoke layer, hugging the water, guns already firing. The harbor exploded into chaos. 14 forward-firing guns per aircraft chewed through anti-aircraft pits, shredded gun crews, and blasted ship bridges apart before Japanese sailors could even swing their weapons into position. Skip bombs slammed into hulls, detonating inside engine rooms, tearing destroyers open like tin cans. In less than 15 minutes, 30 ships were hit, 5 sank outright, and 12 more were damaged beyond repair. Rabaul, once the beating heart of Japan's Pacific operations, was suddenly little more than a burning scrapyard, and Gunn was flying in that attack. He had no obligation to do so. He was a staff officer now, a man whose inventions were already winning battles. But war for Gunn had never been theoretical. His family was still imprisoned in Manila. Every mission took him one heartbeat closer. By early 1944, the strafer had become the most feared aircraft in the Southwest Pacific. Some B-25s carried 8 high-velocity 5-inch rockets under their wings. Others were fitted with napalm tanks, experimental and terrifying. Still others carried parafrag bombs, small parachute-equipped explosives, ideal for striking airfields at near-zero altitude. Each new tactic was tested, refined, and often invented by Gunn himself in the hours before a mission. Pilots joked that if you brought him a problem at midnight, he'd hand you a new weapon system at sunrise. The results were staggering. In the first 8 months of 1944 alone, 5th Air Force strafers destroyed 947 Japanese aircraft on the ground, sank 273 ships, and killed an estimated 38,000 troops. These numbers weren't just victories. They were the collapse of Japan's operational capacity. Every plane destroyed on the ground prevented another Allied bomber from being intercepted. Every barge sunk starved an enemy garrison. Every supply ship lost isolated another battalion. The B-25 wasn't a bomber anymore. It was an ecosystem of destruction. But all the while, Gunn's thoughts drifted constantly to Manila. Reports from Santo Tomas internment camp were bleak. Prisoners were starving. Disease spread uncontrollably. Japanese commanders warned the Red Cross that all captives would be executed if American forces approached the city. Gunn worked harder than ever, flying constantly, pushing himself far beyond exhaustion. Some crew chiefs said he wasn't fighting the Japanese anymore. He was fighting time itself. Then, on November 27th, 1944, time struck first. At 03:30 a.m., 56 Japanese bombers, Mitsubishi G4 Betis, roared over Tacloban airfield on Leyte. 0 escorts followed, low and fast. The bombers slipped under Allied radar and released their loads across fuel depots, tents, and runway aprons. Gunn was in the operations tent when the first bombs hit. The blast knocked him off his feet. Shrapnel tore through canvas walls. A metal fragment slashed into his leg. Another buried itself in his shoulder. Bleeding heavily, Gunn tried to stand, insisting he needed to check on his aircraft, but collapsed after 30 feet. Surgeons worked quickly. His leg artery was damaged. Infection was a real threat. The medical report was final. He would not fly again for at least 6 months. likely longer. At 45 years old, with 26 years of service behind him and 9 Purple Hearts already earned, the Army recommended medical retirement. Gunn refused. His family was still in Manila. He wasn't leaving the Pacific until they were free, and soon events would bring him closer than he had ever been, because the liberation of Luzon was about to begin, and the road to Santo Tomas would finally open. Previously, Papy Gunn had survived the Japanese bombing of Tacloban. Shrapnel tore open his leg. Surgeons declared he would not fly again for 6 months. But Gunn refused to leave the Pacific. His family had endured 3 years inside the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, barely surviving on starvation rations. And now, with the Philippines finally within reach, every moment mattered. By late 1944, the Pacific War had shifted decisively. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had broken the Japanese Navy. The 5th Air Force strangled Japanese logistics from the sky. The ground forces pushed relentlessly north. After 2.5 brutal years of combat, General MacArthur's promise, "I shall return," was no longer a prophecy. It was happening. But for Paul Papy Gunn, the return meant something far deeper. It meant the possibility, faint but real, that he might find his wife and children alive. Santo Tomas internment camp had once been a thriving university in Manila. Now it held more than 3,700 civilian prisoners, Americans, Britons, Dutch, Filipinos, all suffering under malnutrition, disease, and strict Japanese control. Reports filtering out through underground channels were grim. Adults reduced to 90 pounds, children collapsing from malaria, medicine non-existent. Worst of all was the whispered warning. If Allied forces approached Manila, the Japanese commander would execute every prisoner. Gunn heard these rumors constantly. He flew missions against doctors' orders, limped through airfields with bandaged legs, and haunted the operations tents like a man possessed. Pilots described him as running on sheer willpower, a man whose body was failing, but whose mind refused to acknowledge it. The war for him was no longer about strategy. It was about a single destination on a single map. Manila, the city where his wife Polly had held their children together for 3 years. The place he had left behind when the Japanese invaded in January 1942. The place he had feared he might never see again. In early 1945, the final push toward the capital began. On February 3rd, American armored columns smashed through Japanese defenses north of the city, crossing the Tulahan River and racing toward Santo Tomas University. Civilians lined the roads. Soldiers wept as they advanced. After months of jungle warfare, they were entering a major city, and Manila welcomed them like a tidal wave. Inside the camp, prisoners heard distant gunfire, then nearer, then unmistakably close. For hours, they clung to the possibility that rescue was real, that they might survive the war. After dark, American tanks reached the outer walls. One tank, a Sherman, blasted open the main gate. Prisoners surged forward in hysterical disbelief, screaming, crying, falling to their knees as soldiers poured in. Santo Tomas was liberated on February 3rd, 1945. Word spread across the Philippines within hours. It reached Tacloban the following morning, and when Gunn heard the news, he did not wait for permission. He barely waited for a plane. Against medical orders, with stitches still fresh and a cane under his arm, he boarded a transport bound for Manila. Those who saw him that morning remembered his face. Pale, gaunt, exhausted, but shining with a determination that left no room for questions. When he reached the ruins of Manila, and stepped through the shattered gates of Santo Tomas, he found chaos everywhere. Families reunited in tears, nurses carrying half-starved children, soldiers handing out rations to emaciated prisoners. The air smelled of smoke, dust, and something indescribably human, the relief of survival. Inside a makeshift hospital ward, Gunn searched the rows of cots. For a moment he couldn't see her. Then he noticed a thin woman sitting upright, hands folded, hair cut short from months of hardship. She looked at him but didn't react. She didn't recognize him, not at first. 3 years of starvation had changed her. 3 years of war had changed him even more. He stepped closer, said her name, and only then did she understand. Polly Gunn broke down in his arms. Their children, Julia, Nathaniel, and their youngest daughter, gathered around him, skeletal but alive. One weighed barely 63 pounds. Another fought malaria, but they were breathing, and that was enough. The official U.S. Army report stated simply, Colonel Paul Gunn was reunited with his family on February 4th, 1945. It did not mention the tears. It did not mention the trembling hands. It did not mention the 3 years of fear that collapsed in a single moment. The reunion lasted 4 hours. Then, because the war wasn't over, and duty never loosened its grip, Gunn returned to the airfield at Leyte. His wounds hadn't healed. His cane shook under his weight. But he resumed work immediately, inspecting aircraft, guiding modifications, instructing pilots, refusing to slow down even for a night. Those who served with him later said it was as if Gunn believed rest might somehow undo the miracle he had just witnessed. Meanwhile, the 5th Air Force continued its rampage across the Southwest Pacific, with factory-built B-25G, H, and J models now arriving in numbers. The air war changed dramatically. Strafers pounded Japanese airfields before dawn, their parafrag bombs drifting downward like deadly snow. Rockets streaked across coastlines, blasting hidden supply dumps. Napalm tanks ignited defensive bunkers into roaring infernos. The B-25, once merely a medium bomber, had become a weapon system unlike anything in the world. Half aircraft, half artillery battery, entirely lethal. Japan's final convoys were hunted ruthlessly. Barges attempting nighttime resupply were torn apart under moonlit skies. Columns retreating along jungle roads were caught in ambushes coordinated with PT boats and Australian ground forces. The Japanese army in the Philippines, already starving, collapsed without the ability to reinforce or resupply. The air war had reduced their strategic mobility to 0. By summer 1945, the Pacific campaign was nearing its end. While fighters, battleships, and bombers captured headlines, historians quietly noted that no innovation had transformed the Southwest Pacific more profoundly than the low-level gunship. And behind that concept stood one man, a mechanic who had refused to accept the word impossible. For Gunn, the war ended not on VJ Day, but on February 4th, the day he touched his family again. Everything after that was epilogue. He had fought not for glory, not for medals, not even for strategy. He had fought for people, for 4 faces in a camp beyond the front lines, for a promise made the day the Japanese stormed Manila, and though his body continued to break down, his resolve did not. He had survived the war, now he had to survive the peace.